how to think in English. One had always dreamed of speaking English fluently, but there was one problem. He couldn't stop thinking in his native language. Every time he tried to speak, he would mentally translate words, and his sentences became slow and disjointed. One day, his teacher told him, to speak English like a native, you need to think in English. This advice made Juan realize that thinking in his own language was holding him back. He decided that no matter how difficult it would be, he had to stop translating and start thinking in English. At first, Juan struggled with this idea. It felt unnatural to think in a language that wasn't his own. He started with small steps, thinking in English during simple activities like making breakfast or walking to school. He would describe what he was doing in his head using only English words. Although it was challenging, he refused to give up. The more he practiced, the easier it became to form simple thoughts in English. He also began watching movies in English and reading books aloud. At first, he would pause every few minutes to look up new words, but over time, he found that he could understand much more without needing to stop. He realized that language learning wasn't just about memorizing words, but about understanding context and culture. This made him feel more connected to the language. Juan's next step was to practice speaking out loud. He would speak to himself in English, even when no one was around. He felt silly at first, but he soon realized that speaking was just as important as thinking. The more he spoke, the more comfortable he became. His sentences were still simple, but they flowed more easily. Slowly, he started to feel like English was becoming a part of his everyday life. By the end of the month, Juan felt proud of his progress. He still had a long way to go, but he had learned to think in English during his daily activities. He knew that thinking in English would help him speak faster and more naturally. Although he wasn't fluent yet, he was excited to continue his journey. Juan realized that learning a new language was a process, but with practice, anything was possible. Chapter 2: Practicing every day. Juan knew that if he wanted to improve, he had to practice every day. He set a goal to think in English for at least 1 hour each day. It wasn't easy, especially on days when he felt tired or distracted. Sometimes his mind would slip back into his native language, and he would have to catch himself. But he didn't let this discourage him. Every time it happened, he reminded himself that progress takes time. During the day, Juan would find moments to practice. He would think about simple tasks like cleaning his room or making lunch, but in English. At first, it was hard to come up with the right words, but little by little, his vocabulary began to grow. He would look up new words in his dictionary, and sometimes even write them down to remember. He started to feel more confident about using new words in conversation. One also began writing in English. He started a journal where he would describe his day in English. At first, his writing was full of mistakes, but he didn't mind. Writing helped him think in English and improved his grammar. He began to see how words fit together to create sentences and how different phrases could be used in various situations. Writing became an important tool for him in his language learning journey. He also used technology to his advantage. He downloaded apps that helped him practice vocabulary and grammar. Every day, he would spend a few minutes on these apps, making sure to review new words and practice pronunciation. He noticed that his pronunciation was improving, and he was starting to recognize words more easily when he heard them in conversation. One day, Juan realized that he had gone an entire hour thinking only in English. He felt accomplished. It was a small victory, but it showed him that his hard work was paying off. Juan understood now that learning to think in English was a gradual process, but with consistent practice, he was getting closer to his goal. Chapter 3: Watching and Listening. To improve his English even more, Juan began watching English language movies and listening to podcasts. He chose content that was interesting to him, like action movies and stories about travel. At first, he could only understand a few words, but he didn't let this discourage him. He started to focus more on the context of the conversations, trying to guess the meaning of unfamiliar words. He noticed that he could understand more when he wasn't worried about translating every single word. He also paid close attention to how people spoke. He observed the rhythm and tone of their voices, trying to understand how emotions were expressed through language. Juan realized that learning a language wasn't just about knowing vocabulary. It was about understanding how people communicate. Watching movies in English helped him learn phrases that native speakers often used in casual conversation. It also helped him understand cultural references that were common in English-speaking countries. One decided to start listening to podcasts as well. He found several podcasts that focused on language learning, where the speakers talked slowly and clearly. He also listened to podcasts about subjects he enjoyed, such as sports and technology. The more he listened, the more he noticed that English didn't sound as strange to him. Words started to sound more familiar, and he could understand entire sentences without having to pause or rewind. One of the most important things Juan learned was to stop focusing on individual words. Instead, he started listening for the general meaning of the conversation. He realized that even if he didn't understand every word, he could still follow along and understand the main idea. This was a breakthrough moment for him. He understood that language learning was about connecting ideas, not just memorizing words. By the end of the month, Juan felt much more confident in his ability to understand spoken English. His listening skills had improved, and he could follow conversations more easily. He knew he still had a long way to go, but he was excited about the progress he had made. Watching movies and listening to podcasts had become an important part of his practice, and he looked forward to learning even more. Chapter 4: Speaking Without Fear. Juan knew that understanding English wasn't enough. He had to start speaking more if he wanted to improve. So, he made a plan to speak in English every day. He started by talking to himself in English. At first, he felt silly and awkward, but he soon realized that it was helping him get more comfortable with the language. Speaking out loud allowed him to practice his pronunciation and sentence structure. One day, he decided to speak to his friend Maria in English. He felt nervous, but he reminded himself that making mistakes was part of the process. To his surprise, Maria didn't mind his mistakes at all. She encouraged him to keep speaking, and slowly, their conversation became more natural. Juan realized that the fear of making mistakes was holding him back. Once he let go of that fear, speaking English became easier. Over the next few weeks, Juan found that speaking in English was becoming more natural. He no longer had to think about every word before he said it. His sentences started to flow without hesitation. Although he still made mistakes, he didn't worry about them as much. He understood that the more he spoke, the better he would get. Speaking English had stopped being something he feared and had become something he enjoyed. He also started speaking with other friends who were learning English. They would practice together, taking turns speaking and correcting each other's mistakes. Juan realized that he didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to practice as much as possible. The more he practiced speaking, the more confident he became. Speaking in English was no longer something he avoided. It was a part of his daily routine. By the end of the month, Juan was speaking English every day without fear. He felt much more confident in his ability to express himself. His vocabulary was growing, and his sentences were becoming more complex. He knew that speaking in English was an important skill he needed to continue developing. Juan was excited to keep practicing and to see how much more he could improve. Chapter 5: The Change. After several months of hard work, Juan finally realized the true extent of his progress. He was no longer translating in his mind when he spoke. He could think in English without pausing to search for words. Speaking English had become second nature to him. He felt proud of how far he had come, but he knew that language learning was a continuous process. One had learned that thinking in English wasn't just about forcing himself to do it. It was about creating new habits. It was about making English a part of his daily life. He continued practicing every day, reading, writing, listening, and speaking in English. Each new day brought a new opportunity to improve, and Juan was excited to embrace it. He also noticed that his confidence had grown. He wasn't afraid to make mistakes anymore. Every mistake was just another step in his journey toward fluency. He realized that mistakes were a natural part of the learning process, and the more he made, the more he learned. One was no longer afraid to speak in English, even in front of strangers. Juan's friends began to notice his progress as well. They complimented him on how much better his English had become. He smiled, feeling proud of the effort he had put in. But he knew he still had more to learn. He wasn't done yet. He had learned to think in English, but now he wanted to continue improving, to speak even more fluently and confidently. Chapter 6: New Challenges. As Juan continued his journey to learn English, he realized that there were still many challenges ahead. Although he could think and speak in English more comfortably, he knew there was always room for improvement. He wanted to speak with a more natural accent and understand faster. To achieve this, he decided to take on new challenges. He joined an English-speaking group where people practiced together, and he began participating in conversations with native speakers. At first, it was intimidating, but he reminded himself that mistakes were part of learning. In these conversations, Juan noticed how different the real-world language was from what he had studied in textbooks. People spoke faster and used expressions he had never learned. At times, he felt lost, but he didn't give up. He started taking notes on new phrases and expressions that people used. By the end of the week, his vocabulary had grown significantly. The more he practiced with others, the better he became at understanding different accents and slang. One also started reading books written by native speakers. These books were challenging, but he found that they taught him a lot about cultural references and informal language. He was learning not just the language, but also the way people thought and expressed themselves. This opened a new world for him, and he felt more connected to English speakers from different parts of the world. His understanding of English deepened, and so did his appreciation for the language. Despite the challenges, Juan was motivated by his progress. He knew that if he kept working hard, he would continue to improve. His confidence grew as he saw how far he had come. Speaking English no longer felt like a difficult task. It had become a natural part of his daily life. Even when he made mistakes, he took them in stride and used them as opportunities to learn. By the end of the month, Juan felt like a completely different person. He had overcome his fears of speaking with others and had pushed himself to a higher level. He knew that mastering a language was a long-term process, but he was ready for whatever came next. His dream of becoming fluent in English was now within reach, and he couldn't wait to see what the future held. Chapter 7: Expanding Horizons. Juan's progress in English had opened many doors for him. He started to feel more confident not only in conversations, but also in his professional life. At work, he began participating in meetings with international clients. Initially, he was nervous about speaking in front of others, especially in a professional setting, but he quickly realized that his ability to think in English was helping him. He could express his ideas more clearly and understand what others were saying without hesitation. One day, during a meeting with a client from the United States, Juan noticed that he no longer needed to translate his thoughts before speaking. He could answer questions and make suggestions without thinking about the grammar or vocabulary. His colleagues and the client were impressed by his fluency, and that moment boosted his confidence even more. He realized that thinking in English had become a habit that served him in many areas of his life. One also started traveling to English-speaking countries. He visited the United Kingdom and the United States, where he had the chance to immerse himself fully in the language. He found that being surrounded by native speakers helped him refine his accent and pick up more colloquial expressions. He no longer felt nervous speaking in public or in social situations. He enjoyed chatting with locals, making friends, and learning about different cultures. During his travels, Juan discovered that speaking English had not only helped him personally, but also professionally. He was offered a promotion at work, as his ability to communicate with clients in English had become a valuable asset. He knew that his dedication to learning the language had paid off. This motivated him even more to continue improving and expanding his language skills. By the end of his trip, Juan felt more connected to the world. He had seen how language could bridge gaps and create opportunities. He returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that English was not just a language. It was a key to unlocking new experiences and possibilities. He was excited for what the future would bring. Chapter 8: Mastering the Nuances. Although one had come a long way, he knew that true mastery of a language involved understanding its nuances. He started focusing on advanced grammar rules, idioms, and phrasal verbs, things that would make his speech sound more natural. He enrolled in an advanced English course, where he learned how to use idiomatic expressions in everyday conversation. He found this aspect of the language fascinating. It was no longer just about communicating, it was about mastering the art of expression. One of the most interesting things Juan learned was the importance of tone and body language in communication. In his advanced course, the teacher focused on how tone could change the meaning of a sentence. Juan practiced using different tones of voice to express emotions and intentions. He also started paying more attention to his body language, realizing that communication wasn't just about words. It was about how you said them. Juan's fluency continued to improve as he became more comfortable with these subtleties. He started to use idioms and phrasal verbs in his conversations, and they made his speech sound more natural. He found that English speakers appreciated this effort, as it made his language feel less formal and more authentic. The more he practiced, the more his language skills grew. He was no longer just speaking English. He was speaking it like a native. He also started writing more complex texts, such as essays and reports, which challenged him to think critically in English. Writing forced him to use advanced structures and vocabulary, helping him solidify his understanding of the language. He took pride in his writing, knowing that it reflected his progress. He was no longer afraid of making mistakes, but saw them as stepping stones to greater mastery. One had transformed from a beginner who struggled with basic phrases into a confident speaker capable of navigating the complexities of English. He had learned to use the language in many different contexts, and he was eager to keep mastering it. He understood that language learning was a lifelong journey, and he was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 9: Giving Back. As Juan became more fluent, he realized he wanted to help others on their language learning journey. He started tutoring students who were learning English, sharing the methods and strategies that had worked for him. Teaching others gave him a new perspective on his own learning. He realized how much he had grown and how far he had come. Helping others reminded him of the challenges he faced when he first started, and it inspired him to continue improving. Juan's students were amazed by his fluency and his ability to explain complex concepts in simple terms. He would guide them through exercises and conversations, encouraging them to think in English. He taught them how to use the language in practical situations, like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions. His teaching style was relaxed, making his students feel comfortable and confident. Juan found teaching to be incredibly rewarding. He saw how much his students improved and how they gained confidence in speaking English. He became a mentor to many of them, providing not just language lessons, but also motivation and support. It felt fulfilling to see them succeed and to know that he had played a part in their progress. One realized that teaching was just as important as learning. As he continued tutoring, Juan's own language skills improved as well. He began thinking more critically about his use of English and sought ways to fine-tune his own skills. He also learned new teaching techniques that helped him explain difficult concepts in better ways. Teaching others helped him gain a deeper understanding of the language, and he was grateful for this opportunity to grow. By the end of the year, Juan had become an expert not only in English, but in teaching it to others. He knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life. His love for the language and his desire to help others kept him motivated. He was excited for the future and all the ways in which he could continue learning and teaching. Chapter 10: A New Beginning. Juan's journey with English had come full circle. He had gone from a student who struggled to speak to someone who could confidently express himself in any situation. He had mastered the art of thinking in English, speaking naturally, and understanding the nuances of the language. But he knew that his journey wasn't over. There were still new skills to learn, new cultures to explore, and new opportunities to embrace. One of his new goals was to improve his accent further. Although he spoke fluently, he knew that sounding more like a native speaker would give him even more confidence. He started working with a pronunciation coach to fine-tune his accent. This was another challenge he was excited to take on. He knew that learning was a lifelong process, and he was eager to continue growing. One also began writing a blog about his language learning experiences. He shared tips, challenges, and success stories with other learners around the world. His blog became popular, and he connected with people from different countries who were also on their own journeys to learn English. It felt great to be able to give back to the language learning community, just as others had helped him along the way. He continued traveling, learning about different cultures, and expanding his horizons. English had opened up a world of possibilities for him, and he was determined to keep exploring. Juan understood now that learning a language was not just about speaking. It was about connecting with others and experiencing life in new ways. He felt grateful for all the lessons he had learned and excited for the future ahead. Looking back, Juan knew that the most important lesson of all was perseverance. Learning a language was not easy, but with dedication and a willingness to make mistakes, anything was possible. He had come a long way, but he knew that the journey was far from over. English was just the beginning, and he was ready for whatever came next.